It'd been in country for 5 months when I saw it happen. It was hot, humid. Vietnam's jungle heat felt like it could cook you from the inside out. We were at a joint base outside Nui Dat, prepping for a multi-day recon operation with a small Australian SAS team. This wasn't my first time working with the Aussies, but it was the first time I saw one of them do something that made my jaw drop. They were sitting near the weapons pit, casually stripping their gear, checking magazines, wiping down rifles. All routine. Then I watched, no kidding, as one of them pulled out a hacksaw and without hesitation started cutting his rifle in half. At first, I thought he was messing with a damaged spare, or maybe just cleaning the barrel in some weird Aussie way. But no, he was sawing clean through the barrel of a fully functional L1A1 SLR. That thing was their standard-issue battle rifle. A beautiful beast. Semi-auto, 7.62 millimeters, deadly accurate at range. My team and I were frozen. Is he actually? Yep, someone muttered. Hes ruining the damn thing. Within minutes, 2 more Aussies joined in. They sawed off the barrels, shortened the stocks, shaved off unnecessary attachments. One of them used electrical tape to secure the handguard where the front sight had once been. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. To us, our rifles were sacred. You cleaned them like they were your firstborn. You didn't butcher them. We approached one of them, some wiry corporal with a thick accent and a calm, almost bored expression. You realize you're destroying a perfectly good rifle, right? He shrugged. Too bloody long for the jungle, mate. That was it. That was the logic. Too long for the jungle. I looked down at my own M16, which suddenly felt like a tree trunk in my hands. It hadn't been a problem before, not until I saw what those Australians were turning their weapons into. Short, compact, brutal, close-quarter machines. Back at the tent that night, we argued about it. Some of us thought they were reckless. Others thought maybe they were onto something. But one thing was clear, we were rattled. Not by the act itself, but by how sure they were about it. No hesitation, no apologies, just cold, practical efficiency. We were elite. We were trained to adapt, improvise, overcome. But the Aussies had taken that to another level. They didn't wait for doctrine or approval. They didn't care about how things were supposed to be done. They just made their tools match the mission. And as I sat on my cot cleaning my own rifle, suddenly that M16 felt longer than it ever had before. I'd worked alongside recon Marines, Green Berets, and CIA field teams. But the Australians, those SAS guys, were something else entirely. They didn't talk much. They didn't strut around shirtless doing push-ups like some guys I knew. And they sure as hell didn't care about looking operator. Their uniforms were faded, often mismatched. Their webbing setups were homemade, custom-patched with rubber, cloth, and even pieces of bicycle inner tubes. It was like they'd escaped from some forgotten corner of the war, crawled out of the jungle, and built their own version of how things should work. After the rifle-cutting incident, I started paying more attention. They weren't just changing their weapons, they were changing everything. One guy had cut the frame off his rucksack just so he could fit better crawling through elephant grass. Another carried his grenades in an old sock. A third had shaved down the handles of his entrenching tool to make it easier to draw silently. It looked like chaos, but when you watched them move in formation, slow, smooth, surgical, you realized it was anything but. The Americans fought by the book. We had doctrine, flowcharts, equipment SOPs. We trained to the highest standard and believed in the chain of command. And to be fair, it worked, most of the time. But the Aussies, the book didn't apply to them. Their philosophy was different. If it doesn't serve the mission, throw it out. That applied to gear, tactics, even rank. Out in the bush, it didn't matter if you were a sergeant or a captain. The man with the best instinct led. Full stop. That kind of thinking shocked us. We came from a system that prized discipline, uniformity, structure. The SAS came from the edge. They were comfortable with uncertainty, even chaos, as long as it led to results. I remember one of them telling me, while cleaning a sawed-off SLR, "We're not soldiers, mate. We're hunters." Big difference. At first I laughed. Then I thought about it. He was right. They moved like hunters. They stalked, waited, struck, and then disappeared. No firefight unless it was necessary. No lingering. No cleanup. They weren't there to take ground or raise flags. They were there to end threats and survive to do it again. And suddenly, their gear made perfect sense. They didn't care if it looked right. They cared if it worked at the right moment, in the right place. It was hard to admit, but deep down, I respected it. Maybe even envied it. We were elite, yes. But we were still bound by a system that often told us how to fight. They rewrote the rules on the fly. And that day, when they sawed their rifles in half, that wasn't recklessness. That was freedom. Before I came to Vietnam, I trusted my rifle like I trusted my teammates. The M16 had its quirks, everyone knew that, but it was light, accurate, and fast. It did the job in open terrain, in the hills, even in urban contact zones. At least, that's what I thought, until I hit the jungle. In the triple canopy, vine-choked wilderness of Phuoc Tuy, you don't fight like you do on a shooting range. You don't raise your weapon cleanly, or get a full sight picture. Hell, half the time you can't even raise your weapon at all. You're crawling on your belly, vines around your neck, mud up to your thighs, visibility maybe 5 meters ahead if you're lucky. If something moves, you have seconds, maybe one to react. That's when I started to understand the Australians' madness. See, the L1A1 SLR was a monster of a rifle. Long, heavy, and hard-hitting. It fired the 7.62 NATO round with stopping power that punched through brush and bone like butter. But in the jungle, it was a liability. Try turning around quickly in a bamboo thicket with a rifle that's over a meter long. Try getting a clean shot without your barrel catching on vines or rubber tree roots. Try staying quiet when the metal clinks off a branch with every step. The Aussies figured it out before we did. They weren't cutting their rifles out of disrespect. They were doing it out of experience, hard-earned, blood-soaked experience. I learned later that one of their patrols had lost a man because he couldn't swing his SLR around fast enough in a sudden ambush. The muzzle got tangled. He hesitated. The VC didn't, so they took action. They cut the barrels down, shortened the stocks, even removed the flash hiders. What they lost in long-range accuracy, they made up for in survivability in close quarters. Speed is king. It wasn't just their rifles. Their entire kit was optimized for the environment. They wore softer boots, carried fewer magazines, even used lightweight jungle knives instead of standard bayonets. It was all about mobility, reaction time, and silence. We had engineers and procurement officers back in Saigon testing rifles in air-conditioned labs. The Aussies had dirt under their nails, sweat in their eyes, and blood on their uniforms. They didn't theorize. They adapted. At first, we mocked them. Jungle cowboys, we called them. But slowly, quietly, that mockery turned into respect, because they were right. The jungle didn't care how advanced your rifle was if it got you killed before you could fire it. In their hands, a sawed-off SLR was more than a weapon. It was a tool, forged by the environment, modified by necessity, and carried with the calm confidence of men who knew exactly what they needed to stay alive. And it made me realize something I hadn't learned in Bud, S, or in briefings. War doesn't reward the best gear. It rewards the best judgment. It happened about 2 weeks after the rifle-cutting incident, as we jokingly called it. We were operating near the Cambodian border, thick jungle, humid as hell, visibility down to 10 feet if you were lucky. Our joint op was simple on paper. Recon and intercept a suspected VC supply column moving along a dry creek bed. We'd be moving in parallel, our SEAL team on the west ridge, the Aussies on the east. Nothing ever goes as planned. It was early morning. Fog sat low across the canopy, the kind that turns everything into grey silhouettes. Our comms picked up movement ahead. No visuals yet, but we could hear it, light footsteps, occasional metallic clicks, whispered Vietnamese. Then, contact. A VC advance element, maybe 6 or 7 fighters, walked right into the SAS patrol's path. No warning, no time to plan. 1 second it was quiet, the next second, pop, pop, pop. Sharp, muffled shots, fast as a hammer drill. Then silence. Our team froze. We scanned our sector, waiting for the fight to spill into us. It never did. After 5 minutes, we moved to support and got eyes on the Aussie position. What we found stopped us cold. 6 VC bodies, neatly dropped along a narrow path, all shot center mass or head. No stray rounds, no signs of panic, no damage to the environment that wasn't intentional. And there they were, the Aussies, already back in cover, reloading their sawed-off SLRs like it was just another Tuesday. That's when it clicked for me. The cut-down rifles hadn't cost them a thing. In fact, they'd given them exactly what they needed: maneuverability, speed, and a psychological edge. Those shots came so fast and so controlled, I almost thought they were suppressed weapons. But no, it was just well placed. Rapid fire from modified tools built for one environment. This one. Our M16S, by comparison, suddenly felt sterile. Great on paper, but not what I'd want if I was ambushed at 5 meters by a man in sandals holding an SKS. Later that day, during a lull, I found myself walking beside one of the Aussies, the same corporal who'd first sawed his rifle. I nodded toward the weapon. "That thing," I started. It worked. He gave me a quick glance and smirked. "Told you, mate. Jungle doesn't care about specs." He was right, and it burned a little, not out of pride, but because I realized how many fights we'd trained for in theory, while they'd trained for this. That moment rewired something in me. It wasn't just the gear, it was the mindset. The willingness to break rules if the rules didn't fit reality. The guts to take a hacksaw to a service rifle and say, "This will save my life." And on that day, when 6 men with butchered rifles dropped a whole VC squad before we could even react, they proved it wasn't madness. It was mastery. Back at the forward base that evening, the Americans were buzzing. The COs were impressed with the kill report but confused by the after-action breakdown. One of the intel officers asked, "What's this about unauthorized weapons modification?" You could practically hear the alarm bells going off in his head. He wasn't the only one. Word got around quickly. A couple of the rear echelon types started whispering about equipment violations, breach of Allied standards, and risking ballistics integrity. It was classic Doctrine versus dirt, the kind of clash that always happens when the people writing the manuals meet the people who have to survive by breaking them. And in the middle of it were the Australians, calm, unbothered, almost amused. One American captain tried to challenge them. "Why are you cutting down NATO standard weapons without authorization?" The SAS sergeant didn't flinch. He just said, "Because this isn't a NATO standard jungle." Boom. No anger, no excuses. Just a plain fact that hung in the air like gunpowder after a contact. You see, we Americans had grown up in a system that taught structure. Our weapons were cleaned to spec, our gear packed by the book, our tactics drawn from binders thicker than a phone book. Even in SEAL teams, where we were trained to be flexible, there were still boundaries, still expectations, still red tape. But the Aussies, their doctrine came from the field, not from a classroom. They'd fought in Malaya and Borneo. They'd learned the hard way that jungles don't follow bullet points, and their officers, many of them with bush experience, trusted their men to make decisions that worked, not just what looked good on a weapons checklist. And that's what rattled our system. We were used to being the innovators, the elite, the ones who did things differently. But now we were face to face with guys who were even more ruthless in how they stripped down tradition to fit the terrain. It forced some of us to question what we'd been told. Was the rifle a sacred object? Or just a tool? Was the manual more important than the mission? Could you respect the chain of command and still take a hacksaw to your issued weapon because you knew deep down it would save lives? That night, as I sat cleaning my M16, I kept thinking about it. I remembered how fast the Aussies had reacted, how clean their contact had been, how much they trusted their own judgment. No fear of being reprimanded, just clarity of purpose. Some of the guys still scoffed, said it was dangerous, irresponsible. They got lucky, one muttered. Maybe, or maybe they just knew something we didn't. Maybe experience beats doctrine every time if you've got the courage to break the rules and the skill to survive the consequences. Something changed after that firefight near the creek bed. It wasn't spoken outright, there were no formal acknowledgements or handshakes, but we all felt it. The dynamic between us and the Aussies shifted. We started watching them differently, and we started listening. Before, we saw them as a bit rogue, too casual, too informal. We chalked it up to cultural differences, Aussie sarcasm, their love of swearing, the way they seemed to treat war with a kind of grim humor. But now, every decision they made seemed to have a reason. Every strange piece of kit, every odd adjustment, every habit born in the bush, it all made sense. We noticed how their patrol formations changed depending on the terrain, no fixed pattern. How they spent 10 minutes observing a tree line before moving 5 steps. How they listened to the jungle like it was whispering secrets. And how those cut-down rifles, crude as they looked, moved like extensions of their bodies. One of our guys, Rodriguez, had been skeptical from the beginning. A by-the-book operator, squared away, sharp. But even he started asking questions. "You reckon it's worth shortening the barrel a bit?" he asked me one night, running a cleaning rod through his M16. I shrugged. If it means shooting faster in tight bush, maybe. Soon after, a couple of our team started modifying their gear. Nothing major, just small tweaks. Swapping gear pouches, taping down metal clasps. One guy even sawed 2 inches off his cleaning rod so it fit better in his ruck. We were becoming believers. The Aussies didn't gloat. If they noticed, they didn't say anything. That was part of what made them so damn effective. They didn't care about credit. They cared about outcomes. I remember one evening after patrol, I found myself sharing a smoke with one of their corporals, same guy who'd first sawed his rifle. I asked him point blank, "Where'd you learn to think like this?" He looked at me, grinned, and said, "We get taught to survive. Everything else, we figure out on the job." It hit me hard, because back home, we trained like warriors. But out here, they were surviving like hunters. And there's a difference. From then on, we stopped calling them reckless. We started calling them quiet professionals. And I don't think I was the only one who began to realize that discipline doesn't always wear a uniform or follow a manual. Sometimes, discipline looks like a man with dirt on his face, sweat-soaked sleeves, and a rifle that's been sawed in half because he knew head needed to clear a corner faster. By the time the operation ended, there wasn't a man in our unit who doubted their methods. We didn't always understand them, but we respected them, deeply, because in that jungle, respect wasn't given to those who looked sharp. It was given to those who walked out alive. By the 3rd week in the field, I realized I was starting to unlearn things, not abandon them, just question them. Not everything we were taught back home worked out here. In theory, our gear was optimized. Our rifles were battle-tested. Our formations, our SOPs, our engagement protocols, they were textbook perfection. But the jungle didn't care about theory. The Aussies understood that instinctively. They adapted with an almost stubborn practicality. They didn't treat gear like sacred objects. They treated it like gear disposable, modifiable, fixable in the field with whatever you had on hand. Jungle fighting wasn't about having the most advanced tech. It was about having what worked at 10 feet, in 3 seconds, in the mud. Back home, we trained in state-of-the-art kill houses, fast entries, laser-straight corridors, predictable angles. In the jungle, you couldn't see 5 feet ahead, and the only straight line was the one drawn by a bullet. The fight was dirty, fast, chaotic, and that's where the Australians thrived. They didn't just adapt their gear, they adapted their thinking. They weren't chasing doctrine, they were chasing survivability. When they saw something that didn't work, too much weight, too much noise, too much complexity, they didn't wait for permission to change it. They changed it. Because hesitation in the jungle didn't get you killed, it got your whole team killed. Their flexibility didn't mean they were lax. On the contrary, they were some of the most disciplined soldiers I'd ever seen. But it was a discipline rooted in outcome, not appearance. They didn't care how things looked. They cared if they worked when the bullets started flying. I remember watching one of them, this old sergeant with a leathery face and quiet eyes, set up a listening post. No textbook markers, no infrared strobes, just sticks, stones, and jungle tricks. Head spent 2 tours in Borneo. He didn't read about this in a manual. Head lived it. You could feel the experience in the way he moved, slow, deliberate, always scanning. That's when it hit me. We trained to fight. They trained to hunt. And the sawed-off rifles? That was just one part of it. One piece of a broader truth I hadn't fully grasped until then. In asymmetrical warfare, success doesn't come from superior firepower. It comes from superior adaptation. The VC had figured that out. So had the Australians. And the longer we stayed in the jungle, the more I realized we had to catch up not in strength, but in flexibility. By now, I no longer saw those cut-down SLRs as hacked-up mistakes. I saw them as what they were, a quiet rebellion against rigid tradition, a calculated risk in the name of survival. And the men who carried them, they weren't rule breakers, they were rule rewriters. Years later, after Eid rotated back home, I found myself teaching at a special warfare school in the States. Clean uniforms, air-conditioned classrooms, charts, slides, laser pointers, the works. The students were sharp, eager, hungry to prove themselves. One afternoon, during a unit readiness brief, we got into a discussion about weapons optimization. One young trainee asked, "Is it ever acceptable to modify your issued weapon in the field?" Half the room laughed. A few shook their heads. Someone muttered, "Only if you want to get court-martialed." I paused. And then, for the first time in years, I told them the story of the sawed-off SLRs, of the Australians, of the jungle, of the firefight near the creek bed, of the silence, the precision, the cold efficiency that came not from doctrine but from adaptation. I told them how the best gear in the world doesn't mean a damn thing if it gets you killed before you can use it. How true professionalism isn't following every rule, it's knowing which ones to bend when lives are on the line. And when I told them that those butchered rifles had saved lives, that they'd worked better than anything we had in that moment, the room went quiet, really quiet, because some truths don't change no matter how much tech you throw at them. I've carried a lot of weapons in my career. I've fired every rifle our arsenal had to offer, but I never forgot the look of that SAS trooper casually sawing the barrel off his L1A1 in the dirt, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Not because he didn't respect it, but because he respected survival more. That's the legacy of that cut rifle, not the weapon itself, but the mindset behind it, the idea that success in combat isn't about looking right, it's not about standing tall or marching straight, it's about adapting faster than the enemy, about shaving off what slows you down even if that means literally cutting into the very tool you were told never to change. That lesson stayed with me. It shaped the way I operated, trained, and led. I saw it later in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in places where the war looked nothing like the manuals, and every time someone asked why I carried a modified rig or used a field-cut sling instead of standard issue, I just smiled. Somewhere, in the red soil of Vietnam, 6 Australians rewrote the rules of close combat without saying a word. They didn't need medals. They didn't care about credit. What they left behind wasn't a doctrine. It was a way of thinking. See the problem, adapt to the terrain, survive the fight. And if all it takes is a hacksaw, then don't ask for permission.